Okay, so here we are back again after another intermission, and we have been talking about Elizabethan poetry, and we spent a lot of time talking about the sonnet as a poetic form, a very popular poetic form during the early modern period or Renaissance in England. And this is a form at which certain poets excelled in particular. Sir Philip Sidney, we looked at some of his last time. Edmund Spenser, we looked at some of his sonnets last time. And today we're also going to look at some of Shakespeare's sonnets, the great master of them all. And then we'll be moving on into the beginning of our discussions of Hamlet, which will go on for several segments. And this is going to be the subject of a major project that we'll be talking about over the next several class meetings. So, let's go back to Spenser. There's one other thing you'll notice on the syllabus. In addition to sonnets from his collection Amoretti, which we looked at last time, he also wrote, well, he wrote lots of poetry, but he also wrote another poem that we're going to be looking at here, called Epithalamion. Epithalamion. And Epithalamion, let me just write that on here. I know you've got it on your syllabus, but if you don't have that handy, the spelling for that is let's see, is that T-H-A? Yeah, T-H-A, of course. Let's see. I got that right? Okay. And an epithalamion is not only the title of this poem, but it is also the designation for a certain poetic form, and that is a marriage song. A marriage song. And so this is the celebration of a marriage. And I want to look in particular at the description of the bride, because this ties in with a lot of the stuff that we were talking about last time when we were talking about Petrarchan conceits and the influence of the Italian poet Petrarch on the Elizabethan poets in England. And I was also talking about Neoplatonism and how the newly rediscovered elements of Neoplatonism were feeding into the poetic traditions in Elizabethan England. And so let's turn just for a couple of minutes to Spenser's Epithalamion. And I am beginning here at line 148. Line 148. Okay, everybody with me now? This is the description of the bride as she is making her initial appearance. Lo, where she comes along with portly pace, like Phoebe from her chamber of the east. Remember what we talked about last time in connection with the Renaissance, like Phoebe from the east, you know, a reference to classical mythology. Arising forth to run her mighty race, clad all in white, that seems a virgin best, so well it her beseems that you would ween some angel she had been. Her long, loose, yellow locks like golden wire. Remember we saw in one of his poems, the Amoretti, the beautiful woman with her golden hair, and her golden hair is compared to the gold of her actual hairnet, such that her hair seems at least as, and perhaps more beautiful than the gold of the hairnet. Her long, loose yellow locks like golden wire, sprinkled with pearl, and pearling flowers atween, do like a golden mantle her attire, and being crowned with a garland green, a garland, you know what a garland is? A garland is a little crown made out of leaves or flowers. Seem like some maiden queen. Who would that be a reference to? A maiden queen? Elizabeth. Elizabeth. Right, Queen Elizabeth. Why? Because Queen Elizabeth never married, right? And so she was called the Virgin Queen or the Maiden Queen. You know, one need not inquire too deeply into, you know, the biological accuracy of some of those designations. But nevertheless, you know, constantly these were the polite compliments that were paid to her. For example, the state of Virginia was named for Queen Elizabeth because Virginia obviously is the Latin word for the Virgin. So she is like some maiden queen. Well, look how beautiful this young woman is. Well, of course, this is obviously a compliment to Queen Elizabeth, as well as Queen Elizabeth's attractiveness being used to reflect upon the beauty of the young lady here. Her modest eyes abashed do behold, so many gazers as on her do stare. And everybody here, I'm sure, has been to a wedding at some time or another, and so here's the bride coming in, and everybody, of course, now is staring at the bride, right? To see how she's dressed and what she looks like and how pretty she is on her wedding day and so forth. And so she, in her modesty, of course, is slightly embarrassed by this kind of attention. Upon the lowly ground affixed are, this is her eyes, okay, she's looking down. Ne dare lift up her countenance too bold, but blush to hear her praises sung so loud, so far from being proud. Nathless do ye still loud her praises sing, that all the woods may answer and your echo ring. Aha. Tell me, the poet says, ye merchants' daughters, did you see so fair a creature in your town before? Okay, these are clearly middle class, but probably upper middle class people here. But this is not the aristocracy, because notice the reference to you merchants' daughters. So sweet, so lovely, and so mild as she, adorned with beauty's grace and virtue's store. Remember what I was saying last night, and I kept saying this over and over and over again, that within this revived Neoplatonic tradition in poetry, it was not simply the physical beauty of the woman that was admired and praised in poetry, but it was also, and perhaps even more so, her spiritual beauty, because it was her spiritual beauty that would give her her true beauty. Okay? The basic idea is fairly simple and straightforward. I mean, we've all met people who somehow or another, they just light up, right? I mean, they're just sort of, they've got some kind of spirit that, you know, they just light up. Or we may just feel somehow or another struck by the person when we see the person, okay? That's not just physical, sensible things that we are responding to, okay? At least in terms of this tradition. We are also responding to the spiritual energy of the person. Okay. And this, of course, is virtue. Because remember, there's a connection between beauty, true beauty, which is spiritual beauty, and morality in this system. Well, then, of course, we have the description of the lady, the physical description. And notice again the use of Petrarchan conceits. Her goodly eyes like sapphires shining bright. Her forehead ivory white. We're talking about Northern Europeans now. I mean, if this were, in the southern Mediterranean area or in Africa or Asia or someplace else, we would be admiring other qualities of the lady. But we're in Northern Europe here. So her forehead is ivory white. Her cheeks like apples, which the sun hath rudded. Last time somebody asked me about the word ruddy. Ruddy is an older term for reddish. Reddish. So somebody who has a ruddy complexion has a kind of reddish complexion. Her lips like cherries, charming men to bite. Her breast like to a bowl of cream uncrudded. Her paps like lilies budded. Her snowy neck like to a marble tower, and all her body like a palace fair, ascending up with many a stately stair to honor's seat and chastity's sweet bower. What do you suppose? Well, the footnote tells us. I was going to say, what do you suppose that refers to? And the footnote directs your attention to, this is the head, right? We've had a description of the woman, different aspects of her body and of her physical beauty. But of course, ultimately, in terms of this tradition, her snowy neck like to a marble tower, and all her body like a palace fair, ascending up, 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 up. What's at the top of the body? The head. With many a stately stair to honor's seat. That's what the head should be, right? This is right reason that we were talking about at the end of our last class. To honor's seat and chastity's sweet bower. Chastity because she's a maiden. She's a virgin bride. And this is an instance of right reason functioning rightly. Reason, which is a moral faculty as well as an intellectual faculty for these people, should be in control of the passions. Now, once again, there's nothing wrong with the passions, but they need to be directed by and under the control of right reason. And that's what she is being most highly praised for here. Why stand ye still, ye virgins, in amaze, upon her so to gaze? Whiles ye forget your former lay to sing, to which the woods did answer, and your echo ring. And it goes on. But if you saw that which no eyes can see. We've now seen how beautiful she is, especially on this her wedding day. But if you saw that which no eyes can see, the inward beauty of her lively sprite, sprite being an older form of the word spirit, Okay? So if you could but see that, garnished with heavenly gifts of high degree. Remember what I was saying last time about how, according to this way of thinking, God has given to us the higher spiritual faculties, including our reason. And these are gifts from heaven. Much more then would you wonder at that sight, and stand astonished, like to those which read Medusa's maze-full head. Again, a classical allusion. There dwells sweet love and constant chastity. There dwells sweet love and constant chastity. Unspotted faith and comely womanhood, regard of honor and mild modesty, their virtue reigns as queen in royal throne. Again, perhaps with a kind of sidelong compliment to Queen Elizabeth. And giveth laws alone. See, virtue reigns where? In her spirit. And that is what gives laws. The which the base affections do obey. The base affections, the passions, do obey in her, because she is truly virtuous. So see once again that spirit is superior to body in this kind of dualism. Let me put that word down here on our tablet too. Dualism is a term often used by philosophers to talk about a philosophy or view of reality which is dual, which is twofold. And this is a dualism of spirit and body or matter, right? In which, once again, spirit is the principle of perfection, and body or matter the principle of imperfection, which doesn't mean that it's evil. It just means that it is that which is the obvious sign of our imperfection. Whereas spirit is the more perfect part of human nature. And therefore, that should preside, that should rule, that should give laws to the body with its passions. And yield their services unto her will. See, the base affections obey her spirit, her reason. And these base affections or passions yield their services unto her will. No thought of thing uncomely ever may thereto approach to tempt her mind to ill. Had you once seen these her celestial treasures, her celestial treasures. What does the word celestial mean? Heavenly. Yeah, heavenly. Okay. These are treasures which have been given to her by heaven. In other words, by God. So that her greatest treasure is not her physical beauty, but her spiritual beauty, which is a gift from God. And unrevealed pleasures, then would you wonder, and her praises sing, that all the woods should answer and your echo ring. And so then, you know, the poet goes on and celebrates love and, of course, the marriage ceremony which is taking place and so forth. So this is an epithalamion. This is a marriage song. Now, we've talked here before in the traditions of romance about plots in which you have infidelities, adulteries, that sort of thing going on, and complications because of the tension between love and honor, and so on, involving lovers who are not married to one another, and there may be a married person, someone, a third party who's married to one of them, and that creates all the tensions and so forth. Well, we also have a literary tradition which celebrates marriage. And some of the English romances, for example, celebrate marriage. So we shouldn't be, distracted and deterred too much by looking at the traditions of courtly love in the romances. We also have these traditions of the celebration of marriage. And in Chaucer, you have that as well. Okay, so also here. Well, next, let's turn over to, no doubt, the greatest sonnet writer in English, William Shakespeare. Best known, of course, for his plays, but also he's an absolutely amazing poet, even in things like the sonnets outside of his plays. So, let's turn first to the very, very, very well-known sonnet number 18 in his sonnet sequence. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? This is another conceit, right? I mean, the woman is not a summer's day, is she? But a conceit is a comparison, sometimes a very original comparison. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate, even than the summer's day, right? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. What is the this? What's the referent of this? The sonnet, right. The poetry. See, this is one of the things that the poet can do. You know, the poet may not be a great knight. The poet may not be a great athlete. The poet may not be the most dazzlingly handsome guy around. But the poet has a certain power of his own, or her own if it's a woman poet, but here it's a man, because he can make the woman and her beauty immortal through his poetry. And of course, in a sense, that's true. I mean, here we are, centuries later, wowing over this poem and about the woman who apparently inspired it, the so-called dark lady of the sonnets. Okay, Sonnet 29. Let me go back to 18 just for a second. Did you notice how it is divided into 3 quatrains and a concluding couplet? Remember what I said about the English sonnet or Shakespearean sonnet? 3 quatrains, 3 sections of 4 lines each, and then a concluding couplet. So that, look at the first 4 lines. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Those 4 lines involve the conceit of the comparison of the lady's beauty to the beauty of a summer day, right? Then we have a shift. The second quatrain. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, the eye of heaven, of course, being the sun. And often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometimes declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Beauty passes away. Beauty passes away, okay, is the reflection here. And then we move to the third quatrain. But, which begins with, but, thy eternal summer shall not fade. Well, why won't her eternal summer fade? I mean, everybody else's does. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall even death, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest? How could that be? Well, then we come to the concluding couplet of the Shakespearean sonnet. And that's where Shakespeare typically gives a witty turn to the argument. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. With, of course, his claim about the immortality of the woman through the immortality of his poetry. Well, now let's go to 29. Okay? When in disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon myself and curse my fate, wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy, contented least. Yet, in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee, and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered, such wealth brings, that when I scorn to change my state with kings. So, apparently he's had some difficulty with the woman, and yet because he has the memory of her and of his love for her, he would not change his position with that of kings. So, well, let's see what Shakespeare does with some of these conventions, these Petrarchan conventions, by turning to Sonnet 130. Sonnet 130, very famous sonnet. My mistress' eyes are nothing like the sun. Coral is far more red than her lips red. If snow be white, why then her breasts are dun. Dun is an older word for dark. If hairs be wires, black wires grow on her head. I have seen roses damasked red and white, but no such roses see I in her cheeks. And in some perfumes is there more delight than in the breath that from my mistress reeks. I love to hear her speak, yet well I know that music hath a far more pleasing sound. I grant I never saw a goddess go, My mistress, when she walks, treads on the ground. And yet, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she belied with false compare. Okay, that's a pretty straightforward poem. Doesn't require a lot of glossing or explanation. But notice, especially in the earlier parts of this, how he is not only playing with the Petrarchan conventions that we saw in Epithalamion, for example, but he's reversing them, isn't he? He's saying, you know, poets have always said that their mistress' eyes are like the sun, or even outshine the sun, that their lips are like coral, that their breasts are snowy white, that if hair be wires, gold wires grow on their heads, right? And so forth. And their cheeks are like roses, and of course their breath is an endless delight. And the beauty, the musical beauty of their voices, you know, is just ethereal. Well, my lady is a goddess? Well, no, not in this case anyway. I've never seen a goddess. My lady walks on the ground. And yet, by heaven, ironically enough, by heaven, I think my love as rare as any she, as any woman, belied, that is to say, lied about, with false comparisons. So Shakespeare's having fun with the poetic tradition. I mean, it's not simply that he's describing his lady love here and saying, you know, she's a real woman, not some goddess and not some poetic fancy. She's a real woman. But that's precisely why I love her, because she is a real woman. Okay, and we're going to see more of this. John Donne, for example, who's writing a little bit later, is going to be doing the same kind of thing, having fun with those romantic conventions that we associate particularly with Petrarch. Sonnet 138. This is a very witty poem. When my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies. Truth, by the way, and honesty in Shakespeare's time were often used as synonyms for chastity. One of the famous comedies by Shakespeare's contemporaries is called The Honest Whore. The Honest Whore. And of course, there's the ironic play. You see, honest in the sense of being honest, maybe somebody who tells the truth, but also honest in the other sense of chaste. So the whole, I mean, even the title of the play is a joke. So, when my love swears that she is made of truth, I do believe her, though I know she lies. Lies in both senses of lies. Lies in the sense of doesn't tell the truth, but also lies in the sexual sense of lies. And throughout this poem, Shakespeare is playing with both senses of these words. That she might think me some untutored youth, unlearned in the world's false subtleties, thus vainly thinking that she thinks me young, although she knows my days are past the best. See, my vanity lets me think that she thinks that I'm young, even though I know she really knows that I'm past my prime. Simply, I credit her false speaking tongue. Okay? I want to believe these lies. I want to believe what she says about me. Simply I credit her false-speaking tongue. On both sides, thus is simple truth suppressed. See, I pretend to believe her when she lies to me about being faithful to me. And now we can both pretend that it's not a lie when she tells me that I really am young and vigorous, full of life, youth, passion, and so forth. On both sides, thus, is simple truth suppressed. But wherefore says she not, but wherefore says she, not she, is unjust? And wherefore say not I, that I am old? Oh, love's best habit is in seeming trust, is in seeming trust, not real trust, but seeming trust. And age in love loves not to have years told. See, he's getting older now. But he wants to be flattered. He wants the lady to say, oh, no, 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 you're not old at all. You're still young and beautiful, and so on and so on. Therefore, I lie with her, and she with me, and in our faults, by lies, we flattered be. And of course, lie in both senses of lie, both in not telling the truth, but also in the sexual sense of lying. Okay, so Shakespeare's having a lot of fun in this sonnet. We don't know how old he was exactly. The scholars, you can see the dates that are given there, but he certainly was not an old man. But nevertheless, that is the persona, that is the role that he's adopting here in this poem. Okay, how are we doing? Doing great on time. So any questions now about Elizabethan poetry of the sonnet variety, or the Petrarchan tradition, or the Neoplatonic tradition in the poetry? The way in which the conceits are used and so forth? No questions? Yeah, quick question?
For that sonnet we just went over, couldn't that also work for a woman? Because isn't always like it a woman that has to take, like, it cares about her beauty? Mm-hmm. So I mean, was that kind of different to write something like that for him because he was caring about his looks?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I mean, at least conventionally. I mean, I don't know that women are any more vain than men are, or men are any more vain than women are, but or that women generally are vain or men generally are vain. But certainly there are cultural cliches about those things, aren't there? And so a clever poet like Shakespeare can play with those cultural cliches. And so there is a kind of amusing turnabout here, where it's the man who's worried about, how does he look, and, is he getting older, and, what about those gray hairs, and, what about the wrinkles around the eyes, and, does he still have the same muscle tone that he did 10 or 20 years before, and so on and so on and so on. So it's a kind of an amusing stance for the poet speaker in the poem here to adopt. Okay? But that's an interesting question. And again, we're going to see that one of the qualities in really good poetry is the ability to take something that often has become a kind of cliche and turn it into something original. To reconceive it in such a way that it is turned into something original. I mean, how many poets, going back to Sonnet 130, how many poets had compared their lady love's eyes to suns or to deep pools or something or other like that? How many poets had compared her lips to coral, and so on and so on and so on? Well, Shakespeare takes those cliches, those commonplaces, and he does a twist on them. an original twist on them. And in the process, he not only gives us a whole new poetic vision of the lady, but he also creates a poem which is genuinely original. So that originality doesn't always consist in coming up with something that nobody's ever thought of before. I mean, very, very few times in human history has something like that happened. Originality often consists of taking something which might seem to be ordinary, might seem to be commonplace, and finding something original in it, or using it in some original way. So, okay, any other questions about this poetry? Yeah, don't forget to press your button.
I was under the impression that the earlier sonnets are written to a man rather than a woman, that they were written to a patron. And I was looking back through the introduction, and it says that 1 through 17 celebrates the beauty of a young man and urges him to marry and beget children who will bear his image. And then 18 through 26 also focus on the same young man, and it's only the subsequent sonnets which are for the dark lady. Is there some controversy about that, or?
Well, that's actually an interesting point, and the guys who wrote the introductions are, Renaissance scholars, and they're specialists in this literature. There has been debate over the years over the fact that there appear to be 3 people in the sonnet sequence. There's the Shakespeare figure, who obviously is a male poet, of indeterminate age. We don't know exactly how old he is, as I was mentioning earlier, though at least he takes the position and poses as if he's worrying about getting older. There is the woman, usually referred to as the dark lady, in part because she is described, as in Sonnet 130, as having dark hair, right? And perhaps a dark complexion as well, because notice how her skin is also described. So we have the 2 of them, which is obvious, but then there is this third party. There is a young man here as well. And you're absolutely right in drawing our attention to that. And thank you for doing that. Because it's not altogether clear in every one of the poems whether the person being addressed is the man or the woman, and that's especially true in some of those earlier sonnets. This has sometimes led to some discussion of, what are we talking about when we're talking about male and female here, and gender roles, and whether or not gender roles are being transgressed or crossed. And this also is a question that sometimes comes up in Shakespeare's plays, particularly in his comedies. And I'm not going to get away from your question, but I'm going to come back to it in a slightly roundabout way. Let me just explain what I just said about, what he does in his plays, especially the comedies. He will often have a female character who will dress up for some reason or another, typically to disguise herself, as a man. Now, I guess everybody knows this, and if you don't know it, let me just tell you now, that there were no women on the Elizabethan stage. It was against the law, and against the censorship laws. And so, as a consequence, if anybody produced a play with women actors, they could be sent off to jail, not only fined, but sent off to jail. And of course, the theater would be closed and everybody would be out of work. So what you had was men playing the roles of women. Now, the guys who would play the roles of women would usually be smaller in size, and maybe with a more high-pitched voice. They could be like teenage boys, or they could be young men who were not big burly guys, because obviously that would look silly. And so you've got the joke then of a man playing a woman playing a man. Now think about that for a moment. I mean, how would a man playing a woman play at being a man? And so this leads to all kinds of jokes because you're sliding back and forth across gender lines and gender roles. And you can have some characters, particularly in the comedies, who are male, but who will adopt certain kinds of female roles, characteristics, and so forth. And all of this is done in a very playful way in the comedies. Okay? So now, going back to the sonnets, in the sonnet sequence, Shakespeare may be doing this in a somewhat playful way. He may not be. You know, it, again, would be something that would be open to your reading, your interpretation. There is a whole group of critics, literary critics now, who have emerged within the last, 20 years or so, who refer to the kind of criticism that they engage in as queer theory, And what queer theorists do is they deal with exactly these kinds of issues. And interestingly enough, this mode of criticism, literary criticism, has taken on enough stature in the profession that if you go to a conference like the MLA conference, this is the big conference of the most prestigious and most powerful professional organization of English and foreign language college-level teachers in North America. And you look at the program for the MLA, and they will have lots of sessions devoted to gender studies. Some of those devoted to queer theory. But queer theory is more specialized than gender studies in general, because obviously you can do gender studies without necessarily doing queer theory. Though you can't do queer theory without doing gender studies. So, so in any event, you know, we would get into a discussion of those kinds of issues were we to go much farther with it. And that would require that we would actually start going through those poems. You know, what do we find in 1 through 17? And how is the young man treated in those poems? And then, you know, we'd pick up with 18 and go on to, where did you say, was it 126? Okay. And we would look not just overall, but we'd look very specifically at each one of those poems to see how the kinds of questions we've just been considering now would apply. What basis would there be for making certain kinds of claims about gender, gender relations, gender identities, shifts in gender identities, and so forth. So, have I answered your question?
Yes.
Okay, good. But these are just some of the kinds of things, and we're going to be talking about a lot more in our next segment when we get into talking about Hamlet, where in the study of literature, what we're really dealing with is an interpretive discipline, so that what we learn to do as students and as scholars is we learn the methods by which we interpret literary works. Now, the interpretation that I come up with may be different from the one that you come up with, but if both of them are plausible and defensible, we value both. So, okay.